In the glittering snows of a Swiss chalet, a skier's tragic death in an avalanche hides a chilling truth. Was it nature's wrath or a calculated murder? Join Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead, as she unravels a web of ambition, secrets, and betrayal. From a rival's deadly jealousy to a guide's haunted past, every clue points to danger. In just 30 seconds, dive into a mystery where the Alps conceal a killer, and only Miss Marple can expose the truth. Chapter 1. The Alpine Invitation. Miss Jane Marple sat primly in her first-class carriage, the rhythmic clatter of the train a soothing counterpoint to the flurry of snowflakes beyond the window. The Swiss Alps, their peaks sharp and glistening, rose like sentinels against the pale winter sky. She adjusted her lavender shawl, her fingers brushing the soft wool as she contemplated the journey ahead. It was not her habit to venture so far from the familiar comforts of St. Mary Mead, where village intrigues and the gossip of tea-rooms provided ample entertainment for her keen mind. Yet the letter from Lady Beatrice Worthington, penned in her characteristically exuberant hand, had been impossible to resist. "Darling Jane," it read, "you simply must join me at Chalet Montagne, a week of skiing, sparkling company, and alpine air, perfect for shaking off the cobwebs." Beatrice, a vivacious widow with a fortune and a taste for adventure, had recently taken to winter sports with the zeal of a woman half her age. Miss Marple, though no skier herself, was intrigued by the prospect of observing a new cast of characters in such an unfamiliar setting. Human nature, she knew, was as predictable in a Swiss chalet as in a vicarage parlor, and she anticipated no shortage of secrets to unravel. The guest list, briefly outlined in Beatrice's letter, promised a diverse company: a seasoned ski guide, a nervous young companion, a charismatic instructor, and a competitive skier with a reputation for ruthlessness. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled at the thought. People, she mused, were like skeins of wool, tangled until gently teased apart. The train slowed as it approached the Alpine village of St. Moritz, its rooftops dusted with fresh snow. Miss Marple gathered her modest luggage, a single valise containing her essentials and, of course, her knitting, and stepped onto the platform. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Beatrice awaited her, resplendent in a fur-trimmed coat, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Jane, you dear thing," she exclaimed, enveloping Miss Marple in a warm embrace. "You'll adore Chalet Montagne. It's all terribly modern, electric lights, roaring fires, and the most divine hot chocolate. Come, the sleigh is waiting." The sleigh ride to the chalet was a brisk affair, the horses' bells jingling as they glided over the snow-packed road. Beatrice chattered animatedly, describing the chalet's luxuries and its guests. "Hans Müller, our guide, is a local legend, knows every slope like his own hand. A bit dour, mind you, but utterly reliable. Then there's Clara Henshaw, my companion. Sweet girl, but so nervy. Jumps at shadows. Victor Duval, the ski instructor, is an absolute charmer, though I suspect he's after my pearls as much as my company." She laughed, her voice echoing in the frosty air. "And Eric Larsen, the Norwegian skier. Oh, Jane, he's dreadfully handsome but frightfully ambitious. They say he'd sell his soul to win the Alpine Cup." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already cataloguing these descriptions. Beatrice's enthusiasm, she noted, masked a certain unease, as though she sensed discord beneath the chalet's polished veneer. The sleigh drew up to Chalet Montagne, a grand timbered structure with wide windows glowing golden against the twilight. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of cedar and cinnamon. A vast stone fireplace dominated the lounge, its flames casting flickering shadows across plush armchairs and polished wood. Beatrice introduced Miss Marple to the assembled company. Hans Miller stood by the hearth, his weathered face stern beneath a shock of graying hair. His handshake was firm, his eyes appraising, as though measuring Miss Marple's worth. "Welcome, Fräulein Marple," he said, his accent clipped. "I hope you enjoy our mountains, though they are not for the faint-hearted." Clara Henshaw, a slight young woman with mousy hair, offered a timid smile, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Victor Duval, by contrast, was all charm, his dark eyes sparkling as he bowed over Miss Marple's hand. "Enchanté, mademoiselle. Perhaps I can persuade you to try the slopes." His grin was infectious, but Miss Marple detected a practiced edge to it, like a village shopkeeper overly eager to please. Eric Larson was the last to approach, his tall frame exuding confidence. His blonde hair was swept back, his blue eyes cold despite his polite nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but distant, "I hear you're not a skier. A pity. You missed the thrill of the chase." His words carried a faint challenge, and Miss Marple smiled demurely, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. She had seen his type before, men whose ambition outstripped their manners, like young Mr. Thompson in St. Mary Mead, who'd once sabotaged a rival's bicycle to win a race. As the group settled for dinner, served on fine china beneath a glittering chandelier, Miss Marple observed their interactions. Clara's eyes darted toward Beatrice, as though seeking reassurance, while Victor regaled the table with tales of his skiing exploits, his laughter a touch too loud. Hans ate in silence, his gaze occasionally flickering to the window, where snow fell steadily. Eric, seated opposite, spoke little, his attention fixed on his wine-glass, though Miss Marple caught him glancing at the door as if expecting someone. The conversation turned to the upcoming Alpine Cup, and Eric's lips tightened. "Peter Van de Veer will be there," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes hard. "He's fast, but not fast enough." Miss Marple sipped her soup, her mind as sharp as the Alpine peaks. Already she sensed the threads of rivalry, fear, and hidden motives weaving through the group. Chalet Montagne, for all its elegance, was a stage set for drama. As Beatrice raised a toast to new friendships, Miss Marple's needles paused. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that trouble often began with a smile. Here, in the shadow of the Alps, she suspected it would be no different. Chapter 2. The First Descent, Miss Jane. Marple sat in the chalet's lounge, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the morning's bustle from a cushioned armchair by the great window. The Swiss Alps loomed beyond, their snow-clad peaks catching the early sunlight in a dazzling display of white and gold. She had no intention of joining the skiing party, preferring the warmth of the fire and the clarity of observation to the perils of the slopes. Yet the prospect of watching the guests of Chalet Montagne interact in their natural element intrigued her. People, she knew from her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, revealed their true selves under pressure, whether in a village fete or on an Alpine descent. Lady Beatrice Worthington, resplendent in a tailored ski suit of emerald green, was organizing the group with her usual vigor. "Jane, are you certain you won't come?" she called, adjusting her goggles with a flourish. "The air is divine, and Hans promises a gentle slope for beginners." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with amusement. "My dear Beatrice, I'm quite content to admire the view from here. Besides, my knees are better suited to knitting than skiing." She held up her needles, where a soft gray scarf was taking shape as proof of her intentions. Beatrice laughed, undeterred, and turned to rally the others. The party assembled in the chalet's foyer, their ski boots clattering on the polished wood. Hans Muller, the guide, stood at the forefront, his weathered face set in a mask of authority. His broad shoulders filled out his red jacket, and his voice carried the clipped precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Today, we take the Hinterberg slope," he announced, pointing to a map pinned to the wall. "It is moderate, good for all skills, but you must follow my instructions exactly. The mountains do not forgive mistakes." His gray eyes swept over the group, lingering briefly on Erik Larsen, who stood apart, adjusting his gloves with a restless energy. Clara Henshaw, Beatrice's companion, hovered near the door, her ski poles clutched tightly. Her pale face betrayed her unease, and her brown eyes darted nervously toward the towering peaks visible through the window. Miss Marple noted the girl's hesitation, reminiscent of young Emily Baxter back in St. Mary Mead, who had trembled before her first public recital. Fear, Miss Marple mused, often stemmed from more than the task at hand. Was Clara afraid of the slopes, or of something, or someone else? Victor Duval, the ski instructor, was a study in contrasts to Hans's stern demeanor. His dark hair gleamed under the foyer's lights, and his smile was as warm as the chalet's fire. He moved among the guests, offering tips and compliments with practiced ease. "Lady Beatrice, you'll be the star of the slopes," he said, adjusting her scarf with a gallant flourish. Beatrice giggled, clearly charmed, but Miss Marple caught Clara's fleeting frown at the exchange. Victor's charm, she suspected, was a currency he spent freely, but to what end? Erik Larsen, the Norwegian skier, stood aloof, his tall frame radiating confidence. His ski suit, sleek and black, bore the logo of a prominent sponsor, and his blue eyes scanned the group with a hint of disdain. Miss Marple had seen his type before, men like the ambitious Mr. Carver, who had once schemed to outshine his rivals at the St. Mary Mead flower show. Erik's gaze lingered on a young man standing just outside the chalet, waxing his skis with meticulous care. This, Miss Marple deduced, must be Peter Vandeveer, Erik's rival in the upcoming Alpine Cup. Peter's movements were precise, his expression focused, but he glanced up occasionally, his eyes meeting Erik's with a spark of defiance. Hans clapped his hands, drawing attention. "We leave in 10 minutes. Check your equipment now." The group dispersed to gather their gear, and Miss Marple settled deeper into her chair, her needles moving rhythmically. She watched as Clara struggled with her bindings, her fingers fumbling, until Victor swooped in to assist. "There, mademoiselle, all secure," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. Clara murmured her thanks, but her shoulders remained tense. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Erik, who was inspecting his skis with a scowl, muttering something about sabotage under his breath. Peter, overhearing, paused his waxing and shot Erik a sharp look. The air between them crackled with unspoken hostility. Beatrice, oblivious to the undercurrents, chatted animatedly with Hans about the slope's conditions. "Is it quite safe, Hans?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes searching. Hans nodded curtly. "The Hinterberg is stable, Lady Worthington. I checked it myself at dawn." Yet Miss Marple noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. She made a mental note, recalling how old Mr. Grayson in St. Mary Mead had once hidden his worry about a faulty bridge until it collapsed. Men like Hans, she thought, guarded their reputations fiercely. The group set off, their figures shrinking against the vast white expanse. Miss Marple watched from the window, her knitting a steady rhythm in her hands. The slopes were alive with skiers, their colorful suits dotting, the snow like confetti. Hans led the way, his red jacket a beacon, followed by Beatrice, Victor, Clara, and Eric. Peter skied nearby, not part of their group, but clearly intent on the same route. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she observed Eric's frequent glances at Peter, his posture stiff with rivalry. Clara, trailing behind, seemed to shrink into herself, her movements jerky and uncertain. The morning passed uneventfully, the group's laughter and shouts drifting back to the chalet. Miss Marple, joined by Frau Kessler, the chalet's elderly caretaker, sipped tea and listened to the older woman's tales of Alpine life. Frau Kessler's weathered face creased with a smile as she spoke of past winters, but her voice lowered when mentioning Hans. "He's the best guide in St. Moritz," she said, "but he carries a weight. Years ago, there was an incident, a small avalanche, no deaths, but whispers of negligence. Hans was cleared, but he never forgot." Miss Marple nodded, filing away this tidbit. A man with a tarnished past, she knew, might go to great lengths to protect his name. As noon approached, the skiers returned, their faces flushed with exertion and cold. Beatrice burst into the lounge, her eyes bright. "Jane, it was marvelous. The snow was like powder, and Hans was a perfect guide." Victor followed, carrying Clara's skis with a gallant air, though Clara herself looked pale and withdrawn. Eric entered last, his expression stormy, and Miss Marple noticed Peter lingering outside, speaking quietly with another skier. The tension between the two men was palpable, like a storm brewing over the peaks. Lunch was served in the dining room, a feast of hearty soups and crusty bread. Miss Marple, seated beside Beatrice, listened as the conversation turned to the Alpine Cup. Eric's voice was cool, but edged with pride. "Peter's fast, but he lacks discipline," he said, slicing his bread with unnecessary force. "The cup is mine this year." Victor raised an eyebrow, his smile teasing. "Confidence is a fine thing, Eric, but Peter's been training hard. I saw him on the slopes today. He's sharper than ever." Eric's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple noted the flash of anger in his eyes. Clara, picking at her soup, said little, but her gaze flickered nervously between Eric and the window, where Peter could be seen waxing his skis again. Hans, at the head of the table, ate in silence, his thoughts inscrutable. Miss Marple, stirring her tea, recalled a village feud over a prize marrow that had ended in sabotage. Rivalry, she knew, could twist even the most disciplined mind. As the meal ended, a low rumble echoed from the mountains, like distant thunder. The guests froze, their eyes turning to Hans. "A controlled avalanche," he said quickly, his tone firm. "The resort triggers them to prevent larger slides. Nothing to worry about." Yet Miss Marple caught the brief tightening of his hands around his napkin, a gesture that spoke of more than professional concern. Beatrice, ever the optimist, laughed it off. How thrilling, like living in a novel. But Clara's spoon clattered against her bowl, and Eric's gaze lingered on the window, as if searching for something, or someone, in the snow. The afternoon was spent in leisure, with Beatrice coaxing Victor into a game of cards, while Clara retired to her room, claiming a headache. Eric vanished to the equipment shed, and Hans busied himself with maps, planning the next day's route. Miss Marple, her knitting a constant companion, moved to a quieter corner of the lounge, where she could observe without being noticed. She watched as Peter entered the chalet briefly, exchanging a few words with a staff member before leaving again. His presence, she sensed, was a catalyst, stirring tensions that had yet to surface. As evening fell, the group gathered for drinks by the fire. Beatrice, radiant in a sapphire gown, regaled them with tales of her youth, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. Victor's laughter was too loud, his glances at Beatrice too calculated. Clara, returning from her rest, clutched a shawl tightly, her eyes avoiding Eric's. Hans stood by the hearth, his silence heavier than the logs crackling in the flames. Eric, sipping mulled wine, spoke of the Alpine cup with a fervor that bordered on obsession. "Peter thinks he can take me," he said, his voice low but intense. "He's wrong. I've trained for this my whole life. No one will stand in my way." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind as sharp as the Alpine air. She had seen ambition like Eric's before, men who viewed victory as their birthright, like the saint. Mary Mead Butcher, who'd once doctored his scales to win a contract. Eric's words, she thought, carried a weight beyond mere competition. And Clara's unease, Hans's guarded demeanor, Victor's calculated charm, they were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to unravel. As the fire died down and the guests retired, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. The chalet was quiet, save for the soft creak of the settling timbers and the distant howl of the wind. Outside, the Alps stood silent, their beauty masking dangers unseen. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her thoughts turning to the rumble she'd heard at lunch. Controlled, Hans had said. But in St. Mary Mead, she had learned that control was often an illusion, and danger lurked where least expected. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would watch more closely, for in the glittering world of Chalet Montagne, something was amiss, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to discover what it was. Chapter 3. The Fatal Morning. The third day at Chalet Montagne dawned with a brittle clarity, the Alps glistening under a sky so blue it seemed to mock the gathering unease within the chalet's walls. Miss Jane Marple sat by her usual window in the lounge, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, though her eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding outside. The snow lay thick and pristine, a deceptive blanket over the mountain's hidden perils. She had slept lightly, her mind troubled by the tensions she had observed the previous day, Eric's veiled hostility, Clara's nervous glances, Hans's guarded silence, and Victor's overly polished charm. In St. Mary Mead, such undercurrents often preceded trouble, and Miss Marple sensed that trouble was near. Lady Beatrice Worthington burst into the lounge, her energy undimmed by the early hour. She wore a crimson ski suit, her goggles dangling from her neck like a badge of enthusiasm. "Jane, it's a glorious morning," she exclaimed, her breath visible in the chilly air as she flung open a window. "Hans has planned a splendid run today. The Schwarzhorn, a bit steeper, but he says it's safe as houses. You really must come and watch at least." Miss Marple smiled gently, her needles pausing. "I'm quite content here, Beatrice, with my tea and my view. But do tell me about this Schwarzhorn. Is it a favorite of Hans's?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, probing for any hint of unease in Beatrice's reply. "Oh, Hans swears by it," Beatrice said, waving a hand. He says it's challenging but stable, and the views are divine. Eric's thrilled, of course. He's been pestering Hans for something more daring. Peter Vandeveer's joining us too, though he's not officially with our group. Such a rivalry between those two. She laughed, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of concern in her friend's eyes, quickly masked by her usual cheer. The group assembled in the foyer, their voices a low hum against the clatter of ski equipment. Hans Meller stood at the center, his red jacket a stark contrast to the pale wood of the chalet. His instructions were brisk, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The Schwarzhorn is no place for carelessness," he said, his gray eyes sweeping over the group. "Stay in my tracks and signal if you fall behind. The snow is firm, but the mountain is unpredictable." Miss Marple, watching from her vantage point, noted the slight tightening of his jaw as he spoke, as though the mountain's unpredictability weighed on him more than he admitted. Clara Henshaw stood near Beatrice, her ski poles gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face was pale, her eyes darting toward the door as if she longed to flee. Miss Marple recalled a young housemaid in St. Mary Mead, trembling before a confrontation with her employer, and wondered what secret Clara carried that made her so fearful. Victor Duval, ever the gallant, adjusted Clara's scarf with a flourish, his smile as bright as the snow outside. "You'll be fine, mademoiselle," he said, his voice smooth. "Stay near me, and I'll keep you safe." Clara nodded faintly, but her expression remained strained. Eric Larson was already at the door, his skis slung over his shoulder, his face set in a mask of determination. Peter Vandeveer stood nearby, checking his bindings with a quiet focus that contrasted with Eric's restless energy. The two men exchanged no words, but their glances were sharp, like fencers sizing up an opponent. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind cataloging the unspoken rivalry that seemed to pulse between them. As the group set off, Miss Marple moved to the window, her tea cooling beside her. The skiers' figures grew smaller against the vast white slope, Hans leading with his steady stride, followed by Beatrice, Victor, Clara, and Eric. Peter skied parallel to them, his path converging with theirs as they approached the Schwarzhorn's base. The morning was still, the air heavy with the promise of snow. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the group, her instincts prickling. Something, she felt, was amiss, though she could not yet name it. She turned to Frau Kessler, who had joined her with a tray of pastries. "Tell me, Frau Kessler," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "Are avalanches common on the Schwarzhorn?" The caretaker's lined face creased further, her eyes narrowing. "Not common, Fräulein Marple, but not impossible. Hans is careful. He checks the snowpack daily. Still, the mountains have their own will." She hesitated, then added, "There was talk, years ago, of a guide who misjudged a slope. Not Hans, mind you, but it made him cautious. Too cautious, some say." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new piece of information. A cautious man, she thought, might fear a mistake, or fear being blamed for one. The morning wore on, the chalet quiet, save for the occasional creak of the timbers. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her eyes returning to the window. The skiers were mere specks now, weaving down the Schwarzhorn's flank. She was about to turn away when a shout pierced the silence, sharp and urgent. Her needles stilled, her heart quickening. Moments later, another shout, followed by a low, ominous rumble that seemed to shake the very air. The sound was unmistakable, even to Miss Marple's untrained ears. An avalanche. The chalet erupted into chaos. Staff members rushed to the windows, their voices rising in alarm. Frau Kessler dropped her tray, her face ashen. "Mein Gott," she whispered, crossing herself. Miss Marple rose, her movements calm but deliberate, and joined the staff at the window. Far down the slope, a cloud of snow billowed, obscuring the skiers' paths. Her heart sank, but she forced herself to remain composed, recalling the village fire of '32, when panic had only worsened the crisis. Within minutes, Hans's voice crackled over the chalet's radio, terse and urgent. "Avalanche on the Schwarzhorn. Peter Vanderveer is buried. Send the rescue team now." The staff sprang into action, summoning the resort's avalanche rescue unit. Beatrice's voice came next, trembling but clear. "We're safe, but hurry, please." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what she had seen. Peter, not part of their group, had been skiing nearby. Had he strayed too far, or had the avalanche been more than a natural disaster? The rescue team arrived swiftly, their dogs barking as they loaded equipment onto sleds. Miss Marple watched from the lounge, her knitting forgotten, as the chalet's guests returned one by one. Beatrice stumbled in first, her face streaked with tears, her crimson suit dusted with snow. "Oh, Jane," she gasped, collapsing into a chair. "It was dreadful. The snow just gave way. Peter was ahead of us, and then he was gone." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her calm presence a steadying force, but her eyes were already scanning the others as they entered. Victor followed, his charm replaced by a grim expression. He helped Clara inside, her face so pale she seemed on the verge of fainting. "I told her to stay close," he muttered, guiding her to a sofa. Clara said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands trembling. Eric entered next, his skis still slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Hans was last, his face haggard, his red jacket streaked with ice. "The rescue team is digging," he said, his voice hoarse. "But the snow is deep. It may take time." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Hans, noting the exhaustion in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead Farmer, blamed for a barn collapse that wasn't his fault, and the toll it had taken on him. Hans, she suspected, carried a similar burden. She turned to Beatrice, her voice gentle but probing. "Did you see what happened, dear, before the avalanche?" Beatrice shook her head, her eyes brimming. "It was so sudden, Jane. We were skiing, and then there was this roar, like a train. Peter was just ahead, near a ridge. I didn't see anything else." Victor nodded, his voice subdued. "It happened too fast. One moment he was there, the next, gone." Clara remained silent, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. Eric, leaning against the wall, said nothing, but his eyes flickered toward the window, where the rescue team's lights flashed in the distance. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, sorting through the details. An avalanche, Hans had said, could be triggered by the mountain's own will, or by human intervention. She recalled the controlled rumble from the previous day, and Hans's quick dismissal of it. Had someone known the Schwarzhorn's weaknesses? Peter's rivalry with Eric, Clara's fear, Victor's opportunism, Hans's caution. All were threads in a pattern she could not yet fully discern. As the afternoon waned, the rescue team's radio crackled with grim news. Peter Vanderveer had been found, buried beneath 10 feet of snow, his body lifeless. The chalet fell silent, the weight of the tragedy settling over the guests like a fresh fall of snow. Beatrice wept quietly, and even Victor's face lost its usual polish. Clara stared at the floor, her lips moving soundlessly, as if in prayer. Eric's expression remained impassive, but his fingers tightened around his ski poles. Hans stood by the fire, his back to the room, his shoulders slumped. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles a steady rhythm against the silence. She had seen death before, in St. Mary Mead, where poison or a fall could mask darker intents. Peter's death, she felt, was no mere accident. The Schwarzhorn had claimed a life, but someone, she suspected, had given it a nudge. As the fire crackled and the guests dispersed, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She would watch and she would listen. For in the glittering snows of Chalet Montagne, a murderer might walk among them, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to find out who. Chapter 4. Whispers of Motive. The chalet was cloaked in a heavy silence as twilight descended, the Alps outside casting long shadows across the snow-draped valley. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire. In the lounge, her knitting needles moving with their familiar cadence, though her eyes were alert, scanning the room with the quiet intensity of a hawk. The tragedy of Peter Van de Veer's death had left its mark on Chalet Montagne, transforming its once vibrant atmosphere into one of muted grief and unspoken suspicion. Miss Marple, accustomed to the subtle currents of human nature from her days in St. Mary Mead, sensed that the avalanche was no mere act of nature. Someone, she was certain, had played a part in Peter's demise, and she intended to unravel the truth. Lady Beatrice Worthington, her usual exuberance dimmed, sat across from Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "It's too dreadful, Jane," she said, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Peter was so young, so full of promise. To think he's gone, just like that." She shuddered, and Miss Marple offered a sympathetic nod, her needles pausing briefly. "It is a terrible loss, Beatrice," she said gently. "But tell me, dear, what was Peter like? You mentioned he was a rival to Eric. Were they on bad terms?" Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Oh, not bad terms exactly," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Peter was a rising star, you see, new to the circuit but already turning heads. Eric's been the Alpine Cup favorite for years, but Peter was a threat. I overheard them talking once at a dinner last week. Eric was sharp with him, saying something about not letting newcomers steal his thunder. Peter just laughed it off, but there was an edge to it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind filing away this detail. Rivalries, she knew from village squabbles over baking contests, could fester into something far darker. The other guests drifted into the lounge, their faces drawn. Hans Miller stood by the window, his broad frame silhouetted against the fading light. His hands were clasped behind his back, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, as though he bore the weight of the mountain itself. Victor Duval, his usual charm subdued, poured himself a brandy and offered one to Beatrice, who declined with a shake of her head. Clara Henshaw sat in a corner, her mousy hair falling over her face as she stared at her lap, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Eric Larson was the last to enter, his tall figure moving with a restless energy. He avoided the others' eyes, settling into an armchair with a glass of wine, his expression unreadable. Dinner was announced, and the group moved to the dining room, where a somber meal awaited. The chandelier's glow cast a false cheer over the table, its crystal facets glinting like ice. Miss Marple, seated beside Beatrice, observed the group with her usual unobtrusive care. Hans ate mechanically, his gaze fixed on his plate, though his fork paused occasionally, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. Victor attempted to lighten the mood, recounting a tale of a skiing mishap from his youth, but his laughter rang hollow, and no one joined in. Clara barely touched her food, her eyes darting toward the door whenever a staff member entered. Eric, seated at the far end, cut his meat with precise, almost aggressive motions, his silence louder than words. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, turned the conversation to Peter, her tone light but deliberate. "Such a tragedy," she said, addressing the table. "I understand Peter was quite the talent. Did any of you know him well?" Her question hung in the air, and she watched the reactions closely. Hans's fork stilled, his eyes flicking up briefly before returning to his plate. Victor shrugged, his smile tight. "I trained him a few times," he said. "Good skier, but headstrong, always pushing the limits." Clara's hand trembled, and she set down her spoon, her face paling further. Eric's response was curt. "He was a competitor," he said, his voice flat. "I respected his skill, nothing more." Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words, recalling a St. Mary Mead grocer who'd claimed to respect a rival while spreading rumors about his wares. After dinner, the group returned to the lounge, where a fire roared against the evening chill. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her chair positioned to afford a view of the room. Beatrice, still shaken, excused herself to write letters, her departure leaving a void in the conversation. Clara rose abruptly, muttering about needing air, and slipped out to the veranda. Miss Marple's eyes followed her, noting the girl's hurried steps. There was something, she thought, that Clara was not saying, something that weighed on her like the snow on the Schwarzhorn. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple approached Hans, who stood alone by the hearth, staring into the flames. "Mr. Muller," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you must feel this loss keenly, as the guide responsible for the group's safety." Hans's head jerked up, his gray eyes narrowing. "I did all I could, Fräulein Marple," he said, his accent thickening. "The Schwarzhorn was checked, the snowpack was stable. Avalanches, they happen." His words were defensive, but Miss Marple detected a note of guilt, like that of a St. Mary Mead gardener, blamed for a blight he couldn't prevent. "Of course," she said soothingly, "but it must be difficult, with your reputation so tied to the mountains." Hans's jaw tightened, and he turned back to the fire. Without reply, Miss Marple's attention shifted to Victor, who was now engaging Eric in conversation by the bar. Their voices were low, but she caught fragments, words like sponsor and pressure. Victor's hand rested briefly on Eric's shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie, but Eric shrugged it off, his expression darkening. Miss Marple recalled a village doctor who'd used charm to mask ambition, and wondered what Victor stood to gain from Peter's absence. A wealthier client, perhaps, or a favor repaid. Clara's return interrupted her thoughts. The girl's cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes were wide, as if she'd seen something unsettling. She sank into her chair, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "Are you quite all right, Miss Henshaw?" Miss Marple asked, her tone maternal. Clara started, her handkerchief twisting tighter. "Yes, I just needed air," she stammered. "The mountains, they feel so close." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. Clara's fear, she suspected, was not of the mountains, but of something, or someone, within the chalet. As the evening wore on, Eric rose abruptly, excusing himself with a curt nod. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the way his hand lingered on the doorframe, as if reluctant to leave the room's warmth. She turned to Frau Kessler, who was clearing away glasses, and engaged her in quiet conversation. "Such a sad day," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "Did Peter have many friends here, Frau Kessler?" The caretaker's eyes softened, but her voice was cautious. "He was well liked, Fräulein, but not close to our guests, except perhaps—" She hesitated, glancing toward Clara's corner. Miss Henshaw spoke to him often. She seemed fond of him. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. A fondness, she knew, could complicate matters, especially if it was unrequited or forbidden. The fire burned low, and the guests began to retire. Miss Marple lingered, her knitting a pretext for observation. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead's scandal, where a young woman's secret love had led to betrayal. Clara's nervousness, Eric's cold ambition, Victor's calculated charm, Hans's guarded demeanor, each was a piece of a puzzle, and Peter's death was its dark center. Miss Marple's needles moved faster, her mind sifting through motives. An avalanche could be a natural disaster, but it could also be a weapon wielded by a hand driven by envy, fear, or greed. As she rose to retire, Miss Marple paused by the window, gazing out at the Alps, their peaks ghostly under the moonlight. The snow was silent, but it held secrets, just as the chalet did. She resolved to speak with Clara tomorrow, to probe gently at the girl's fears, and she would watch Eric closely, for his rivalry with Peter seemed the strongest thread in this tangled web. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that truth lay in the smallest details. A glance, a pause, a lie half-spoken. Here, in the shadow of the Alps, she would find those details, and with them, the truth of Peter van de Veer's death. Chapter 5. The Guide's Secret. The morning after Peter van de Veer's death broke cold and gray, the Alps shrouded in a mist that seemed to mirror the gloom within Chalet Montagne. Miss Jane Marple sat in her accustomed spot by the lounge's great window, her knitting needles moving with their steady rhythm, though her eyes were fixed on the muted landscape beyond. The snow fell softly, muffling the world outside, but within the chalet the air was thick with unspoken questions. Peter's death had cast a pall over the guests, and Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature honed in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, knew that grief often concealed darker truths. She was determined to uncover them, starting with Hans Miller, the guide whose stern demeanor hid something more than professional concern. Lady Beatrice Worthington entered the lounge, her usual vibrancy subdued. She wore a woolen sweater instead of her bright ski suit, and her face was drawn, as though she had slept poorly. "Jane, it's all so wretched," she said, sinking into a chair beside Miss Marple. "I keep seeing poor Peter, buried under all that snow. Hans blames himself, you know. He was saying last night that he should have checked the slope again." She sighed, twisting a ring on her finger. "He's such a stoic man, but this has shaken him." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but searching. "It must be difficult for him, dear," she said. "A guide's reputation is everything, isn't it? To have such a tragedy occur under his watch." She left the sentence hanging, watching Beatrice's reaction. Beatrice nodded, her eyes distant. "Yes, Hans takes it personally. He's been guiding here for 20 years, and never a mishap like this. Well, not quite." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "There was an incident, years ago, Not fatal, but an avalanche on a slope he'd deemed safe. He was cleared, but some still whisper about it. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained placid. "How unfortunate," she murmured, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead carpenter blamed for a faulty roof that collapsed during a storm. Gossip, she knew, could cling like damp to a reputation. "Does Mr. Muller speak of it?" she asked, her tone casual. "Never," Beatrice replied. "But you can see it in his eyes, sometimes, a fear of being doubted." She rose, smoothing her sweater. "I'm off to write to Peter's family. It's the least I can do." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, but her thoughts were already turning to Hans. A man haunted by a past mistake, she mused, might act to protect his name, or to avoid another blot on it. The lounge was quiet, the other guests slow to emerge after the previous day's shock. Miss Marple took the opportunity to seek out Frau Kessler, the chalet's caretaker, whose knowledge of local affairs had already proven valuable. She found the elderly woman in the kitchen, kneading dough with hands gnarled by years of work. "Good morning, Frau Kessler," Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool with her knitting. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was just thinking about poor Mr. Muller. He must feel this tragedy keenly." Frau Kessler's hands stilled, her eyes narrowing as she regarded Miss Marple. "Ja, Fräulein Marple, it weighs on him," she said, her voice low. "Hans is a proud man. The mountains are his life, and to lose a skier—" She shook her head, returning to her dough. "That incident years ago, it nearly broke him. A small avalanche, no one hurt badly. But the talk, it followed him. People said he misjudged the snowpack. He was young then, eager to prove himself. The authorities found no fault, but Hans, he carries it still." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "And now, with Peter's death, those whispers must surface again," she said, her tone gentle but probing. Frau Kessler's lips tightened. "Ja, some at the resort are already talking. They say Hans should have known the Schwarzhorn was unstable, but I know Hans. He checks every slope like a surgeon. If there was a mistake, it was not his." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of doubt in her eyes, quickly masked. Thanking Frau Kessler, Miss Marple returned to the lounge, her mind turning over this new information. Hans's past, she thought, was a shadow that loomed over him, much like the Alps over the chalet. A man so protective of his reputation might take drastic measures to safeguard it, or to deflect blame. She resolved to speak with him, to gauge his demeanor for herself. Hans appeared shortly after, his red jacket replaced by a plain wool sweater, his face etched with fatigue. He carried a stack of maps, spreading them on a table near the fire. Miss Marple approached, her knitting bag in hand, her smile disarming. "Mr. Muller," she said, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. These mountains are so grand, but so perilous. How does a guide like yourself ensure safety?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any sign of unease. Hans looked up, his gray eyes guarded. "It is a matter of experience, Fräulein Marple," he said, his voice steady but clipped. "I study the snowpack, the weather, the wind. I test the slopes myself. The Schwarzhorn was safe, or so I believed." His last words carried a faint bitterness, and Miss Marple noted the way. His hand tightened around a pencil, snapping it in two. "It must be a heavy burden," she said softly, "to carry such responsibility, especially after, well, I heard there was an incident some years ago." Hans's head jerked up, his face hardening. "That was different," he said sharply. "A mistake, not mine. The snow shifted unexpectedly. No one died." He paused, his gaze dropping to the maps. "This time, I don't know how it happened. I checked everything." His voice was low, almost a whisper, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of self-doubt in his eyes, like a crack in a glacier. She nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Of course, Mr. Muller, no one could doubt your diligence." But as she returned to her chair, her mind was racing. Hans's defensiveness, his insistence on his thoroughness, suggested a man desperate to prove his competence. Had he overlooked something on the Schwarzhorn, or had someone exploited his vigilance? She recalled a saint, Mary Mead blacksmith, blamed for a faulty horseshoe, who had gone to great lengths to restore his name. Hans, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth. The other guests began to gather, their movements sluggish, as though the weight of Peter's death pressed on them all. Clara Henshaw entered, her face pale and her eyes red, as if she had been crying. She sat far from the others, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Victor Duval followed, his usual charm tempered but still evident as he offered Clara a cup of coffee, which she accepted with a faint nod. Eric Larson was absent, and Miss Marple wondered if he was avoiding the group, or perhaps avoiding scrutiny. Beatrice returned, her eyes brighter, but her smile forced. "I've written to Peter's mother," she said, joining Miss Marple. "Such a terrible task. I mentioned how fond everyone was of him." She glanced at Clara, then lowered her voice. "Though I wonder about Clara. She's been so quiet since yesterday. I think she knew Peter better than she lets on." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind seizing on this. "Indeed," she said, her tone neutral. "Young people often form attachments quickly. Perhaps Miss Henshaw admired his skill." Beatrice nodded, but her expression suggested she suspected more. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with Clara, to probe gently at her connection to Peter. A hidden affection, she knew, could complicate motives, much like a village romance that had once led to a stolen heirloom in St. Mary Mead. As lunch was served, Miss Marple observed the group closely. Hans ate sparingly, his eyes fixed on the window, where the snow continued to fall. Victor's conversation was subdued, his anecdotes less polished than usual. Clara picked at her food, her gaze darting toward the door whenever it opened. When Eric finally appeared, his face was set in a grim line, and he took a seat apart from the others, his silence a barrier. Miss Marple noted the way his hand gripped his glass, as if anchoring himself against a storm. After lunch, she lingered in the lounge, her knitting a pretext for observation. She approached Clara, who was staring into the fire, her face drawn. "Miss Henshaw," Miss Marple said gently, "you seem troubled. Is there anything an old woman might do to help?" Clara started, her eyes wide. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's just the shock, you know? Peter was so kind, so full of life." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her fingers twisting her handkerchief. Miss Marple nodded, her tone soothing. "He must have been a fine young man. Did you know him well?" Clara hesitated, her lips trembling. "Not well," she said quickly. "We talked sometimes, about skiing, about the Alps. He was encouraging." Her words were halting, and Miss Marple sensed a truth withheld, like a letter half read. She did not press further, knowing that patience often coaxed secrets to the surface. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Hans. his past, his pride, his insistence on the Schwarzhorn's safety, they formed a pattern, but not a complete one. Had he made a mistake, or had someone used his diligence against him? And Clara's reticence, Eric's absence, Victor's subdued charm, they were all threads in a tapestry that was growing darker by the hour. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her mind as sharp as the Alpine peaks. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that secrets, like snow, could be disturbed by the lightest touch. Here, in Chalet Montagne, she would find the right touch to reveal the truth. Chapter 6. Clara's Burden. The fourth day at Chalet Montagne unfolded under a sky heavy with the threat of snow, the Alps looming like silent judges over the valley below. Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar armchair by the lounge's great window, her knitting needles clicking with their steady rhythm, though her eyes were fixed on the figures moving within the chalet. The tragedy of Peter Van de Veer's death had settled over the guests like a frost, chilling their interactions and casting long shadows of doubt. Miss Marple, with her keen insight into the frailties of human nature, honed through years of observing the villagers of St. Mary Mead, was certain that Peter's death was no mere accident. The threads of suspicion, Eric's rivalry, Hans's guarded past, Victor's calculated charm, and Clara's nervous reticence were weaving a pattern, and Miss Marple was determined to trace it to its source. Today, her focus turned to Clara Henshaw, whose fearful demeanor suggested a secret too heavy to bear alone. Lady Beatrice Worthington, though still shaken, was attempting to restore some semblance of normalcy. She bustled into the lounge, her cheeks flushed from a morning walk, and settled beside Miss Marple with a sigh. "Jane, I've been trying to keep everyone's spirits up," she said, her voice lower than usual. "But it's no use. Clara's been crying all morning, and Hans is like a bear with a sore head. Even Victor's lost his sparkle." She glanced toward the corner where Clara sat, hunched over a book she wasn't reading, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. "I do wish Clara would confide in me," Beatrice added. "She's been so dreadfully quiet since Peter's death." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze softening as she followed Beatrice's line of sight. "Young people often carry their troubles silently," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "Miss Henshaw seems particularly affected. Perhaps she was fond of young Mr. Van de Veer?" Beatrice's eyes widened slightly, as if the thought had only just occurred to her. "You know, Jane, you might be right. She was always chatting with him after dinner about the slopes or some such thing. I thought it was just friendliness, but now—" She trailed off, her expression troubled. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead seamstress whose quiet affection for a local lad had led to heartbreak when he left for London. Clara's behavior, her red eyes, her trembling hands, her avoidance of the others, suggested more than casual acquaintance with Peter. "Perhaps I'll have a word with her," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "Sometimes an outsider's ear is easier to speak to." Beatrice smiled gratefully, unaware of the sharp mind behind Miss Marple's kindly demeanor. The lounge was quiet, with only a few guests stirring. Hans Müller was absent, likely tending to his duties or avoiding the chalet's oppressive atmosphere. Victor Duval was at the bar, polishing glasses with a distracted air, his usual charm replaced by a furrowed brow. Eric Larson had yet to appear, his absence noted by Miss Marple as another thread in the tapestry of suspicion. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and approached Clara, settling into a chair beside her with the ease of a village ant. "Good morning, Miss Henshaw," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and inviting. "I hope you don't mind an old woman keeping you company. It's such a melancholy day, isn't it?" Clara started, her book slipping slightly in her lap. Her brown eyes were rimmed with red, and her face was pale, as though she hadn't slept. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, it's very sad." She looked away, her fingers tightening on her shawl. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click a soothing counterpoint to Clara's unease. "I couldn't help but notice how much Mr. Vandeveer's death has affected you," she said gently. "He must have been a fine young man. Did you know him well?" Clara's breath caught, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might bolt from the room. But the girl remained, her eyes fixed on her lap. "Not terribly well," she said, her words halting. "We talked sometimes. He was kind, always encouraging me to try the slopes, even though I'm no good at skiing." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw a tear glisten on her cheek. There, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone maternal. "It's natural to grieve for a friend, but you seem so troubled, more than one might expect for a passing acquaintance." She paused, letting the silence work its gentle pressure. Clara's fingers twisted her shawl, and her lips parted, as if on the verge of confession. "It's just, I heard something," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "The night before the avalanche, I was in the corridor, and I heard Peter and Eric arguing. It was late, near the equipment shed. Eric was angry, something about Peter sabotaging his skis. Peter denied it, but Eric wouldn't listen. He said Peter would regret crossing him." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained soft. "How distressing," she said. "Did you tell anyone about this, Miss Henshaw?" Clara shook her head, her face crumpling. "No, I didn't know what to do. I thought it was just talk. Eric's so competitive. But now—" She broke off, her hand covering her mouth. Miss Marple patted her arm, her mind racing. An argument, overheard in the dead of night, suggested a motive far darker than rivalry. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Baker, whose heated words with a rival had led to a poisoned loaf, and wondered if Eric's anger had found a more deadly outlet. Before she could press further, Victor approached, his smile a pale imitation of his usual charm. "Miss Henshaw, you're looking peaky," he said, his tone solicitous. "Shall I fetch you some tea?" Clara shook her head, rising quickly. "No, thank you, Mr. Duval. I need to rest." She hurried from the room, her book forgotten on the chair. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the way Victor's eyes followed her, a flicker of calculation in his gaze. Was he merely concerned, or was he keeping tabs on Clara's confidences? Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts turning to the argument Clara had described. Eric's accusation of sabotage, Peter's denial. It painted a picture of a rivalry that had crossed into dangerous territory. She needed to confirm Clara's story, but delicately, for the girl was fragile, like a saint. Mary Mead, schoolgirl caught in a lie she regretted. Miss Marple resolved to observe Eric more closely, to see if his demeanor betrayed the anger Clara had overheard. The opportunity came after lunch, when the guests gathered in the lounge to discuss the resort's decision to close the Schwarzhorn slope pending an investigation. Eric entered, his tall frame filling the doorway, his face set in a mask of indifference. He took a seat by the window, his eyes fixed on the snow outside, though Miss Marple noted the tension in his hands, clenched around a ski magazine. She approached, her knitting bag in hand, and settled nearby, her smile disarming. "Mr. Larson," she said, her voice light, "you must be disappointed about the Alpine Cup. I understand Mr. Vanderveer was a formidable opponent." Eric's head turned sharply, his blue eyes narrowing. "Peter was good," he said, his tone clipped, "but I'd have beaten him. I always do." His words were confident, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease, as if he regretted speaking so boldly. "Of course," she said, her needles clicking. "But rivalries can be so trying, can't they? I once knew a young man in my village who argued fiercely with a competitor over a race. It ended badly, I'm afraid." She let the words hang, watching Eric's reaction. His jaw tightened, and he turned back to the window. "Rivalries are part of the game," he said curtly. Peter knew that. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind was alert. Eric's defensiveness, coupled with Clara's revelation, suggested a deeper conflict, one that might have led to more than words. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple sought out Frau Kessler, hoping to glean more about the chalet's dynamics. She found the caretaker in the linen room, folding sheets with practiced efficiency. "Frau Kessler," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "you must hear all sorts of things working here. Did Mr. Vanderveer and Mr. Larson often argue?" The caretaker's hands paused, her eyes wary. "Ja, Fräulein Marple," she said. "They were like stags, always clashing. Peter was young, hungry for victory. Eric saw him as a threat. I heard them once, near the shed, shouting about skis and sponsors. It was not friendly." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The equipment shed, she thought, was a place to investigate further. Returning to the lounge, Miss Marple noticed Clara, slipping a piece of paper into her pocket as she passed through to her room. The edge of the paper bore a distinctive script, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the name Peter before it disappeared. A letter, perhaps, or a note, something Clara was desperate to keep hidden. Miss Marple's needles moved faster, her mind weaving together the threads of Clara's fear, Eric's anger, and the mysterious note. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden letter had once revealed a betrayal. Here, it might hold the key to a murder. As evening fell, the chalet grew quiet, the guests retreating to their rooms or the fire's warmth. Miss Marple remained, her knitting a steady companion. Clara's burden, she sensed, was more than grief. It was knowledge, perhaps dangerous knowledge. Eric's rivalry, Hans's past, Victor's opportunism, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and Clara's secret might be the one to make it whole. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her resolve firm. She would find a way to coax Clara's truth to the surface, for in the silent snows of Chalet Montagne a killer lurked, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 7. The Instructor's Charm. The fifth day at Chalet Montagne dawned with a deceptive calm, the Alps bathed in a pale light that filtered through a veil of high clouds. Miss Jane Marple sat by the lounge's great window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her gaze was fixed on the subtle interplay of the guests within the chalet. The tragedy of Peter Vanderveer's death had tightened the threads of suspicion that wove through the group. Eric's fierce rivalry, Hans's shadowed past, Clara's hidden fears, and Miss Marple was certain that the avalanche was no act of chance. Her attention now turned to Victor Duval, the ski instructor whose polished charm seemed to mask a deeper intent. In St. Mary Mead, she had known men like Victor, smooth talkers, whose smiles hid ambitions as sharp as a blade, and she was determined to uncover what lay beneath his genial facade. Lady Beatrice Worthington entered the lounge, her energy subdued, but her spirits bolstered by a new resolve to distract the group from their grief. She wore a soft blue sweater, her usual bright ski attire abandoned, and her face bore the traces of sleepless nights. "Jane, I've decided we must do something cheerful today," she announced, settling beside Miss Marple with a cup of coffee. "I've asked Victor to organize a little snowshoe walk for those who don't wish to ski. It's gentle, and Hans says the lower trails are safe. Poor Clara needs cheering up, and even Eric might benefit from a change of scene." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes crinkling with a gentle smile. "A fine idea, Beatrice," she said. "Mr. Duval seems just the man to lift everyone's spirits. He has such a way with people, doesn't he?" Her tone was light, but her words were deliberate, probing for Beatrice's thoughts on the instructor. Beatrice nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Oh, Victor's a charmer, no doubt, always so attentive, especially to the ladies. But I wonder sometimes if he's a bit too eager to please. You know how it is. Some men see a title or a fortune and can't help themselves." She laughed, but her eyes held a flicker of unease. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead solicitor who had used his charm to swindle elderly widows. Victor's attentiveness, she suspected, was not entirely altruistic. "He must be very popular with the guests," she said, her voice mild. "Does he spend much time with the younger set, like Mr. Vanderveer or Miss Henshaw?" Beatrice tilted her head, considering. "Not so much with Peter, I think. Victor trained him, occasionally, but Peter was so focused on his skiing. Clara, though, Victor's always fussing over her, adjusting her skis or offering her tips. She doesn't seem to care for it, mind you." Miss Marple filed this away, noting Clara's discomfort as another piece of the puzzle. The lounge began to fill as the morning progressed. Clara Henshaw entered, her face pale and her movements hesitant, as though she feared drawing attention. She sat in a corner, her hands folded tightly, her eyes avoiding the others. Hans Miller appeared briefly, his expression grim as he conferred with a staff member about the resort's investigation into the avalanche. Eric Larson was absent, his continued absence noted by Miss Marple as a sign of either guilt or calculation. Victor Duval, however, was in his element, moving among the guests with a smile that seemed to brighten the room. He approached Clara, offering her a snowshoe pamphlet with a flourish. "Mademoiselle, you must join us today," he said, his voice warm. "The trails are beautiful, and I'll make sure you don't stumble." Clara murmured a polite refusal, her eyes darting away, and Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple rose and approached Victor, her knitting bag in hand. "Mr. Duval," she said, her smile disarming, "you're so kind to organize this outing. It must be a challenge, keeping everyone's spirits up after such a tragedy." Victor's dark eyes sparkled, though Miss Marple caught a fleeting wariness in them. "It's my job, Miss Marple," he said, his tone smooth. "A little distraction goes a long way. Poor Peter's death has shaken us all, but life must go on." His words were practiced, but Miss Marple sensed a calculation behind them, like a village shopkeeper weighing his words to secure a sale. "You must have known Mr. Vanderveer well as his instructor," she said, her needles clicking softly. "Was he as talented as they say?" Victor's smile tightened, and he shrugged. Peter was gifted, no question, but he was reckless, always pushing the limits, taking risks on the slopes. I warned him more than once to be careful. His tone was regretful, but Miss Marple noted the lack of warmth in his eyes, as though Peter's death was an inconvenience rather than a loss. As Victor moved to organize the snowshoe group, Miss Marple sought out Frau Kessler, whose local knowledge had already proven invaluable. She found the caretaker in the equipment room, sorting ski poles with her usual efficiency. "Frau Kessler," Miss Marple said, settling onto a bench with her knitting. "Mr. Duval seems such a charming man. Does he often spend time around the equipment sheds?" The caretaker's hands paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Ja, Fräulein Marple. He's often there, checking gear for the guests, but I saw him there the night before the avalanche, late when most were in bed. He said he was fixing a binding, but—" She trailed off, her expression guarded. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her face remained placid. "How curious," she said. "It must take dedication, working so late." Frau Kessler nodded, but her silence suggested she shared Miss Marple's suspicion. A man in the equipment shed at odd hours, Miss Marple thought, might have more than repairs on his mind. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead Gardner caught tampering with a rival's tools and wondered if Victor's charm concealed a similar intent. Determined to investigate, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the equipment shed, her shawl wrapped tightly against the Alpine chill. The shed was a sturdy structure, its walls lined with skis, poles, and bindings. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. Near a rack of ski poles, she spotted one marked with the initials PV, Peter Van de Veers. The tip was slightly bent, as though it had been deliberately damaged. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind racing. A faulty pole could unsettle a skier, especially on a treacherous slope like the Schwarzhorn. Was this Victor's doing, or merely an accident? Returning to the chalet, Miss Marple found the lounge buzzing with preparations for the snowshoe walk. Beatrice was rallying Clara, who reluctantly agreed to join, her face still pale. Victor was in high spirits, distributing snowshoes with his usual flair, though Miss Marple noted his frequent glances at Clara, as if gauging her mood. Hans appeared briefly, his face set in a scowl, and declined to join the outing, citing paperwork for the resort's investigation. Eric, arriving late, agreed to come, his expression distant but his eyes sharp, as though watching for something. The snowshoe walk proceeded without incident, the group trudging through the lower trails under Victor's cheerful guidance. Miss Marple, remaining behind, used the quiet to reflect. Victor's presence in the shed, the tampered pole, his attentiveness to Clara, they suggested a man who played his cards carefully, perhaps too carefully. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Vicar, who had used his charm to secure donations, only to be caught funneling them to his own ends. Was Victor's charm a mask for greed, or something more sinister? At dinner, the mood was slightly lighter, thanks to Beatrice's efforts and Victor's anecdotes about the day's walk. Yet Miss Marple's attention remained on Victor, noting how he steered the conversation away from Peter's death, focusing instead on the beauty of the trails. Clara ate little, her eyes fixed on her plate, while Eric's silence was punctuated by sharp glances at Victor, as if he sensed a rival in more than skiing. Hans, joining them late, spoke little, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her knitting a steady companion. Victor's charm, she concluded, was a tool, perhaps one used to distract from darker deeds. The tampered pole, his late-night presence in the shed, his interest in Clara, they were pieces of a puzzle that did not yet fit. But in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that even the most polished surface could hide a crack. She would watch Victor closely, and with Clara's secret and Eric's anger still to unravel, she knew the truth of Peter's death was within reach, hidden in the shadows of Chalet Montagne. Chapter 8. Eric's Ambition. The 6th day at Chalet Montagne unfolded under a sky heavy with the promise of a storm, the Alps looming like silent sentinels cloaked in gray. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary armchair by the lounge's vast window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar cadence, though her sharp eyes were attuned to the undercurrents of tension rippling through the chalet. The weight of Peter Van de Veer's death pressed on the guests, transforming their interactions into a delicate dance of suspicion and restraint. Miss Marple, with her keen insight into the darker corners of human nature, honed through countless village intrigues in St. Mary Mead, was certain that the avalanche was no act of nature alone. Her thoughts now turned to Erik Larsen, the Norwegian skier, whose fierce ambition seemed to cast a shadow as long and cold as the peaks outside. Lady Beatrice Worthington entered the lounge, her usual exuberance replaced by a quiet determination to maintain civility among her guests. She wore a simple wool dress, her bright ski attire abandoned, and her face carried the strain of sleepless nights. Settling beside Miss Marple, she sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Jane, I'm at my wit's end," she confessed, her voice low. "Eric's been impossible since Peter's death, snapping at everyone, barely joining us for meals. I know he and Peter were rivals, but his coldness, it's unsettling." She glanced toward the door as if expecting Eric to appear. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but probing. "It must be difficult for him, dear," she said, her tone gentle. "Young men with ambition can be so consumed by it, can't they? I knew a lad in my village, desperate to win a county fair prize, who let his rivalry cloud his judgment. Was Mr. Larsen very focused on the Alpine Cup?" Beatrice nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Obsessed, Jane. He talked of little else, how this was his year, how no one, not even Peter, could stop him. I heard him speaking to his sponsor yesterday, boasting that Peter's absence all but guaranteed his victory. It was callous, don't you think?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, though her expression remained placid. "Indeed," she said, her mind recalling a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, who had sabotaged a rival's roses to secure a village prize. Eric's ambition, she suspected, was a fire that burned too brightly, perhaps hot enough to ignite a tragedy. "Did he and Mr. Van de Veer ever clash openly?" she asked, her voice mild. Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening around her cup. "Not openly, but there was tension. At a dinner last week, Eric made a sharp remark about Peter's new sponsor stealing his thunder. Peter just smiled, but you could see it stung. Eric's not one to share the spotlight." Miss Marple nodded, filing away this detail. A man who saw victory as his birthright, she thought, might go to great lengths to eliminate a threat. The lounge was quiet, with only a few guests stirring. Clara Henshaw sat in her usual corner, her face pale and her hands clutching a book she wasn't reading. Victor Duval was absent, likely tending to his duties as instructor. though Miss Marple noted his absence with interest, given her suspicions about his late-night presence in the equipment shed. Hans Müller had been seen earlier, conferring with resort officials about the Schwarzhorn investigation, his face etched with a grim resolve. Eric, however, was nowhere to be seen, and Miss Marple wondered if his absence was deliberate, a way to avoid scrutiny or to nurse his thoughts in solitude. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple sought out Frau Kessler, whose local knowledge had proven a valuable thread in the tapestry of clues. She found the caretaker in the pantry, organizing supplies with her usual efficiency. "Frau Kessler," Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool with her knitting, "you must see all sorts of rivalries here, with so many skiers vying for glory. Was Mr. Larsen particularly competitive with Mr. Vanderveer?" The caretaker's hands paused, her eyes narrowing as she considered the question. "Ja, Fräulein Marple," she said, her voice low. "Eric is like a wolf, hungry, always watching. He and Peter were fire and ice. Eric wanted the Alpine Cup, and Peter was the one to beat. I saw them arguing once, near the lodge, about a race last season. Eric accused Peter of cutting him off on a turn. Peter laughed, but Eric, his eyes were cold." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "How unfortunate," she said. "Ambition can drive men to rash actions, can't it?" Frau Kessler's lips tightened, and she returned to her work, but her silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple's mind turned over the caretaker's words, picturing Eric's cold eyes and Peter's defiance. A rivalry so intense, she thought, could easily spill over into something deadly, like a St. Mary Mead feud over a stolen recipe that had ended in sabotage. As the morning wore on, Eric finally appeared, his tall frame filling the lounge doorway. His blonde hair was disheveled, and his blue eyes were shadowed, as though he had slept poorly. He carried a ski magazine, but his fingers gripped it tightly, betraying his tension. Miss Marple watched him settle into an armchair by the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames, though she sensed his thoughts were elsewhere. She approached, her knitting bag in hand, her smile as disarming as a village ant's. "Mr. Larsen," she said, settling nearby, "you must be disappointed about the Alpine Cup. It's such a pity about Mr. Vanderveer. He seemed such a worthy rival." Eric's head turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Peter was good," he said, his voice clipped. "But I'd have won. I always do." His words were confident, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his expression, as if he regretted his boldness. "Of course," she said, her needles moving steadily. "But rivalries can be so taxing, can't they? I knew a young man in my village who let his competition with another lad consume him. It led to unfortunate choices." She let the words hang, watching Eric's reaction. His jaw tightened, and he flipped open the magazine, though his eyes didn't focus on the pages. "Competition makes you stronger," he said curtly. "Peter knew the game. He played it well. Too well, sometimes." His tone carried a bitter edge, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers crumpled the magazine's edge. She smiled gently, her mind racing. Eric's words, coupled with Clara's account of his argument with Peter, painted a picture of a man whose ambition might have crossed into obsession. At lunch, the atmosphere was strained, the guests' conversation muted by the weight of the tragedy. Beatrice tried to steer the talk to lighter topics, but her efforts fell flat. Clara ate little, her eyes fixed on her plate, while Hans, joining them late, spoke only to confirm that the resort's investigation was ongoing. Victor, returning from his duties, attempted to inject some levity, but his anecdotes lacked their usual polish. Eric ate in silence, his gaze distant, though Miss Marple caught him glancing at Clara, as if assessing her mood. After the meal, Miss Marple lingered in the lounge, her knitting a pretext for observation. She overheard Eric speaking to a staff member about a phone call with his sponsor, his voice low but intense. "With Peter gone, it's mine," he said, his tone triumphant. "No one else comes close." The words were chilling, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary mead merchant who had rejoiced at a rival's bankruptcy, only to be found guilty of arson. Eric's ambition, she thought, was a fire that could burn more than his competitors. It could consume him. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple approached Beatrice, who was organizing a card game to distract the group. "Beatrice, dear," she said, her voice soft, "has Mr. Larson always been so driven? I imagine the pressure of the Alpine Cup must be immense." Beatrice sighed, setting down a deck of cards. "Driven doesn't cover it, Jane. Eric lives for that race. Last year when Peter nearly beat him, Eric was furious, trained twice as hard this season. I heard him tell Victor he'd do anything to win this time. Anything." Her voice dropped, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained serene. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple sought out the equipment shed again, her suspicions about Eric's argument with Peter prompting her to look for evidence of their clash. The shed was quiet, its racks of skis and poles bathed in the dim light of a single bulb. She examined the area where Peter's gear had been stored, her sharp eyes catching a faint scratch on a ski marked with Eric's initials. It was subtle, but deliberate, as if someone had tampered with the edge. Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind recalling Clara's story of Eric accusing Peter of sabotage. Had Eric taken matters into his own hands, or was this another's work meant to cast suspicion on him? Returning to the chalet, Miss Marple found the lounge bustling with the card game, though Eric sat apart, his magazine discarded. Clara's eyes flickered toward him, her face pale, and Miss Marple wondered if the girl feared more than she had admitted. Victor, dealing cards, caught Miss Marple's eye and offered a smile, but she sensed a wariness in him, as if he knew she was watching. Hans, entering briefly, announced that the Schwarzhorn would remain closed, his voice heavy with fatigue. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady companion. Eric's ambition, she concluded, was a force as relentless as the Alps themselves. His rivalry with Peter, his cold triumph at his rival's death, the scratched ski, they were all threads in a pattern of motive. But was Eric the weaver, or merely a strand in a larger design? In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that ambition could blind a man to consequence, and here, in the shadow of the Alps, she suspected Eric's ambition had led to a fatal misstep. She would watch him closely, for the truth of Peter's death was drawing nearer, hidden in the cold heart of Chalet Montagne. Chapter 9. The Avalanche's Clue. The seventh day at Chalet Montagne broke with a biting wind, the Alps shrouded in a restless swirl of snow that seemed to echo the unease within the chalet's walls. Miss Jane Marple sat by the lounge's great window, her knitting needles moving with their steady rhythm, though her sharp eyes were fixed on the storm outside, where the peaks vanished into a gray haze. The tragedy of Peter Van de Veer's death had tightened the web of suspicion around the guests. Eric's ruthless ambition, Hans's shadowed past, Victor's calculated charm, and Clara's hidden fears, and Miss Marple was certain that the avalanche that claimed Peter's life was no mere whim of nature. Her mind, honed by years of unraveling village intrigues in St. Mary Mead, was now focused on finding a tangible clue, something to anchor her suspicions, in fact. Today, she resolved to investigate the Schwarzhorn slope itself, for the mountain, she believed, held the key to the truth. Lady Beatrice Worthington entered the lounge, her face pale, but her demeanor resolute. She wore a heavy shawl. Over her dress, her usual vibrancy dulled by the weight of recent events. Settling beside Miss Marple, she clutched a letter she had been writing, her fingers trembling slightly. "Jane, I can't stop thinking about poor Peter," she said, her voice low. "The resort officials are still investigating, but they say it's likely just an accident. I don't know. Something feels wrong. Hans is beside himself, insisting he checked the slope thoroughly." She glanced toward the window, where the snow fell in relentless sheets. "I wish we could know what really happened up there." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze softening as she regarded her friend. "It is troubling, Beatrice," she said gently. "The mountains are so vast, yet they hold their secrets tightly, don't they? Perhaps if we could see the Schwarzhorn again, it might tell us something." Her tone was mild, but her words were deliberate, planting the seed of action in Beatrice's mind. Beatrice's eyes brightened slightly. "You're right, Jane. Hans might take us up there, if only to show us where it happened. It could ease his mind, too." She rose, determined to speak with the guide, and Miss Marple smiled, her plan quietly taking shape. The lounge was subdued, with only Clara Henshaw present, curled in a corner with a cup of tea she barely touched. Her face was drawn, her eyes shadowed, as though her secret weighed heavier with each passing day. Victor Duval and Eric Larson were absent, their whereabouts unknown, though Miss Marple noted their absence with interest, suspecting they were avoiding the chalet's oppressive atmosphere. Or perhaps each other. Hans Müller appeared shortly after, his red jacket replaced by a heavy coat, his face etched with a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. Beatrice approached him, her voice coaxing. "Hans, I was wondering if you might take a few of us to the Schwarzhorn, just to see where it happened. It might help us all find some closure." Hans's gray eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "It is not safe, Lady Worthington," he said, his accent clipped. "The slope is closed, and the storm is coming." But Beatrice's persistence, coupled with her charm, softened his resolve. "Please, Hans," she said, "for Peter's memory. We'll be careful, and you'll be with us." Miss Marple watched, her needles clicking softly, as Hans relented with a curt nod. "Very well," he said, "but only a small group, and we stay on the edge of the slope." Miss Marple, though no skier, volunteered to join, citing a desire to pay her respects, and Beatrice, touched by her friend's gesture, agreed. The journey to the Schwarzhorn was a somber affair, the group bundled against the wind in a horse-drawn sleigh. Hans led the way, his face grim, while Beatrice and Miss Marple sat together, Clara having declined to join, her fear of the mountains too great. Victor appeared at the last moment, offering to assist Hans, his smile subdued but present. Eric remained at the chalet, his absence noted by Miss Marple as another sign of his unease. The sleigh glided through the snow, the Alps looming like silent witnesses, and Miss Marple's eyes scanned the landscape, searching for anything out of place. At the base of the Schwarzhorn, Hans halted the sleigh, pointing to the ridge where the avalanche had struck. The slope was a chaotic jumble of snow and debris, the rescue team's efforts still evident in the churned tracks. "Here," Hans said, his voice low, "is where Peter was caught. The snow came from above, near that outcrop." He gestured to a rocky ledge, its edges softened by fresh snow. Miss Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly, stepped carefully from the sleigh, her eyes sharp despite the wind's sting. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Farmer, who had found a clue to a theft in the ruts of a cart track, and she hoped the Schwarzhorn would yield a similar revelation. As Hans explained the mechanics of avalanches, his voice steady but strained, Miss Marple moved closer to the ridge, her steps slow but deliberate. "Mr. Muller," she said, her tone curious, "could an avalanche like this be triggered by something other than nature? A vibration, perhaps, or a deliberate act?" Hans's head jerked up, his eyes narrowing. "It is possible," he admitted, his voice cautious. "A loud noise, a heavy weight, even a small explosive could destabilize the snowpack, but I saw nothing like that. The slope was stable when I checked it." His words were firm, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of doubt in his eyes, like a crack in ice. She nodded, her gaze sweeping the area. Near the outcrop, half buried in the snow, she spotted a glint of metal, small but unmistakable. Pretending to adjust her shawl, she knelt, her fingers brushing the snow aside to reveal a compact device, no larger than a cigarette case, with wires protruding from its side. It was an explosive charge, carefully concealed, its surface marked with frost, but intact. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. She covered it again, marking its location with a small stone, and rose, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden tool had once betrayed a saboteur. Here, this device could point to a murderer. Returning to Hans, she kept her discovery to herself, knowing the importance of timing. "Such a tragic place," she said, her voice soft. "You must feel it keenly, Mr. Muller, as the guide." Hans's face darkened, his hands clenching. "I did my duty," he said, his voice hoarse. "The slope was safe. I don't know how this happened." His words carried a desperation that Miss Marple noted, suspecting he feared more than just blame. He feared the truth. Back at the chalet, the group dispersed, their mood somber. Beatrice retired to write another letter, her face etched with grief. Victor lingered, offering to help Hans with the sleigh. But his eyes followed Miss Marple, as if sensing her scrutiny. Clara remained in her corner, her book untouched, while Eric appeared briefly, his expression unreadable as he grabbed a drink and retreated. Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting a steady companion, her thoughts fixed on the explosive device. It was no accident, she was certain, but who had placed it? Hans, desperate to protect his reputation. Victor, with his late-night visits to the shed. Eric, consumed by ambition. Or Clara, hiding a secret that might drive her to desperate measures. At dinner, the atmosphere was strained, the guests' conversation stilted. Hans ate in silence, his gaze fixed on his plate, while Victor's attempts at levity fell flat. Clara's hands trembled as she sipped her water, and Eric's eyes darted toward the window, as if the storm outside mirrored his own turmoil. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, steered the conversation gently toward the avalanche. "It's so curious," she said, her tone innocent, "how such a disaster can strike so suddenly. Mr. Mueller, you mentioned vibrations. Could something as small as a device cause such a thing?" Hans's fork paused, his face paling. "It could," he said curtly, "but I saw no such thing." His words were sharp, and Miss Marple noted the way Victor's smile tightened, as if he sensed a trap. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her knitting a pretext for reflection. The explosive device was the clue she had sought, a tangible link to Peter's death. Someone with knowledge of the slopes and access to such a device had orchestrated the avalanche. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden letter had once revealed a crime. Here, a hidden charge might do the same. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her resolve firm. She would return to the Schwarzhorn with Hans to retrieve the device under the guise of further inspection, and she would watch the guests closely, for one of them had set a deadly trap, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to bring them to justice. Chapter 10. Unraveling Lies. The 8th day at Chalet Montagne dawned with a restless energy, the storm of the previous night having abated to leave a brittle, crystalline stillness over the Alps. Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar armchair by the lounge's great window, her knitting needles moving with their steady rhythm, though her sharp eyes were attuned to the shifting dynamics within the chalet. The discovery of the explosive device on the Schwarzhorn slope had confirmed her suspicions. Peter Vandeveer's death was no accident, but a calculated act of murder. The threads of motive, Eric's ambition, Hans's shadowed past, Victor's opportunism, and Clara's hidden fears were now tangled with this new evidence, and Miss Marple, with her keen insight honed in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, was determined to unravel the lies that concealed the truth. Lady Beatrice Worthington entered the lounge, her face pale but her resolve unbroken. She wore a heavy sweater, her usual elegance subdued by the weight of recent events, and settled beside Miss Marple with a sigh. "Jane, I can't bear this gloom any longer," she said, her voice low. "The resort officials are still poking about, but they're calling it an accident. I don't believe it. Not after what you saw on the slope yesterday. That device? It's too dreadful to think about." She shuddered, her hands twisting together. "I've half a mind to confront everyone, to demand the truth." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but probing. "That would be unwise, dear," she said gently. "People guard their secrets fiercely, especially when guilt is involved. But if we gather them together, we might see who falters under scrutiny." Her tone was mild, but her mind was sharp, envisioning a scene where careful questions could coax the truth to the surface, much like a St. Mary Mead tea party that had once exposed a thief. Beatrice's eyes brightened, seizing the idea. "You're right, Jane. I'll ask Hans to call everyone to the lounge after lunch. We'll say it's to discuss the investigation. Nothing confrontational. Just a chance to clear the air." The lounge was quiet, with the guests scattered, their absence a testament to the strain that Peter's death had imposed. Miss Marple used the morning to reflect, her knitting a steady companion as she pieced together the clues. The explosive device, carefully hidden, suggested someone with knowledge of the slopes and access to such equipment. Hans, as the guide, knew the Schwarzhorn intimately, but his distress seemed genuine. Victor's late-night presence in the equipment shed raised questions, as did his tampered ski pole. Eric's rivalry with Peter, fueled by ambition, was a motive as old as time, while Clara's nervous secrecy hinted at a deeper connection to the victim. Each was a thread, but which led to the killer? After a subdued lunch where the guests ate in near silence, Beatrice rallied them to the lounge, her voice firm but kind. "We need to talk about what happened," she said, standing by the fire as Hans, Victor, Clara, and Eric gathered, their faces a mix of reluctance and unease. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap, her eyes missing nothing. Hans stood by the window, his broad frame tense, while Victor leaned against the bar, his charm dimmed but his gaze alert. Clara perched on the edge of a sofa, her hands twisting a handkerchief, and Eric sat apart, his blue eyes cold and guarded. Beatrice began, her tone measured. "The resort believes Peter's death was an accident, but we all feel there's more to it. Jane saw something on the slope yesterday, a device hidden in the snow. We need to know what each of you saw or heard that day." Her words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the reactions. Hans's jaw tightened, Victor's smile faltered, Clara's face paled, and Eric's fingers clenched around his armrest. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice soft but deliberate, turning to Clara. "Miss Henshaw, you've been so quiet since the tragedy. You mentioned hearing an argument between Mr. Vanderveer and Mr. Larson the night before. Could you tell us more?" Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching. The room turned to her, and she shrank under their scrutiny. I didn't mean to eavesdrop," she stammered. "It was late, near the shed. Eric was shouting, saying Peter had tampered with his skis. Peter denied it, said Eric was paranoid. I didn't think it mattered, but after—" Her voice broke, and she pulled a folded paper from her pocket, her hands trembling. "Peter gave me this that night. It's a letter. He was afraid of Eric, said he'd been threatened before." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained serene. She took the letter, its edges worn, and read silently. "Clara, I don't trust Eric. He's said things about making sure I don't win. Be careful. Peter." The room was silent, all eyes on Eric, who leaned forward, his face darkening. "That's nonsense," he snapped. "Peter was trying to undermine me, spreading lies to make me look bad. I never threatened him." Miss Marple turned to Hans, her tone gentle but firm. "Mr. Muller, you know the Schwarzhorn better than anyone. You said the slope was stable, yet we found that device. Did you see anything unusual that morning?" Hans's face paled, his hands clenching. "I saw nothing," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I noticed Eric near the ridge before we started. He was adjusting his gear, or so he said. I thought nothing of it then." His words were reluctant, as if betraying a confidence, and Eric's eyes flashed with anger. "You're lying!" Eric shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "I was nowhere near the ridge. You're trying to shift blame, Hans, because you failed as a guide." Hans's face reddened, but he said nothing, his silence heavy. Miss Marple noted the exchange, recalling a St. Mary Mead blacksmith who had deflected blame to protect his own guilt. She turned to Victor, her voice mild. "Mr. Duval, you were in the equipment shed the night before the avalanche, weren't you? And we found a tampered ski pole with Peter's initials. Can you explain that?" Victor's smile vanished, his dark eyes narrowing. "I was fixing bindings," he said, his tone defensive. "I saw Peter's pole. It was damaged, so I tried to repair it. I didn't tamper with anything." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of panic in his gaze, like a village merchant caught with a short measure. Clara's eyes darted to Victor, her fear palpable, and Miss Marple wondered if she knew more than she had revealed. The room crackled with tension, each accusation tightening the web of suspicion. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind sorting through the lies. Clara's letter confirmed Peter's fear of Eric, but her hesitation suggested she was protecting someone, or herself. Hans's observation placed Eric near the ridge, but his own guilt over the avalanche made his testimony suspect. Victor's explanation for the tampered pole was plausible, but his presence in the shed was too convenient. And Eric's vehement denial, coupled with his ambition, painted him as the most likely culprit. Yet Miss Marple knew that the obvious answer was not always the true one. As the group dispersed, their faces drawn, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her knitting a steady companion. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead's scandal, where a flurry of accusations had obscured the real culprit, revealed only by a quiet confession. The explosive device, Clara's letter, Hans's testimony, Victor's deflection. They were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was incomplete. She needed one more thread, one more truth to tie them together. In the silent snows of Chalet Montagne, a killer hid behind a mask of lies, and Miss Jane Marple was determined to strip it away. Chapter 11. The Final Piece. The 9th day at Chalet Montagne dawned with a piercing clarity, the Alps standing stark against a sky scoured clean by the previous night's storm. Miss Jane Marple sat by the lounge's great window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her sharp eyes were fixed on the interplay of light and shadow across the snow-draped peaks. The confrontation in the lounge the previous day had unraveled a tangle of lies. Clara's letter revealing Peter's fear, Hans's testimony placing Eric near the fatal ridge, Victor's dubious explanation for the tampered ski pole. But the truth of Peter Vandeveer's death remained just out of reach. Miss Marple, with her keen insight honed in the quiet intrigues of St. Mary Mead, knew that one final piece was needed to complete the puzzle, and she was determined to find it before the killer's mask slipped beyond her grasp. Lady Beatrice Worthington entered the lounge, her face drawn, but her resolve unshaken. She wore a heavy shawl, her usual elegance subdued by the weight of suspicion that hung over the chalet. Settling beside Miss Marple, she clutched a cup of tea, her fingers unsteady. "Jane, I hardly slept," she confessed, her voice low. "Yesterday was dreadful, everyone pointing fingers, and that letter from Peter. It's too much. I can't believe Eric would do such a thing. But then, who else?" She glanced toward the door, as if expecting an answer to walk through. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze softening but alert. "It's a troubling business, Beatrice," she said gently. "But truth has a way of surfacing, like a stone beneath melting snow. We must be patient and watch closely." Her tone was calm, but her mind was racing, sifting through the clues. The explosive device on the Schwarzhorn, Clara's revelation of Peter's fear, Hans's observation, Victor's deflection. Each pointed to Eric, but Miss Marple knew from village scandals that the most obvious culprit was not always the guilty one. She needed evidence, something irrefutable to tie the threads together. The lounge was quiet, the guests slow to emerge after the previous day's tensions. Clara Henshaw sat in her usual corner, her face pale and her hands clutching a shawl, her eyes darting nervously whenever the door opened. Victor Duval was at the bar, polishing glasses with a distracted air, his charm replaced by a guarded watchfulness. Hans Müller had been seen earlier, meeting with resort officials, his face etched with a weary determination. Eric Larson, however, was absent, his continued avoidance noted by Miss Marple as a sign of either guilt or calculation. Determined to press forward, Miss Marple sought out Frau Kessler, whose local knowledge had been a steady guide through the chalet's secrets. She found the caretaker in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with her usual efficiency. "Frau Kessler," Miss Marple said, settling onto a stool with her knitting, "you must hear many things in a place like this. Did Mr. Larson ever associate with anyone unusual? Someone who might know about explosives, perhaps?" The caretaker's knife paused, her eyes narrowing as she considered the question. "Ja, Fräulein Marple," she said slowly. "A few days before the avalanche, I saw Eric speaking with a man in the village, a local, Karl Brunner. He's known for handling explosives, helps with controlled avalanches for the resort. I thought it odd, but Eric said it was about ski routes." Her voice carried a hint of suspicion, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "How curious," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. "And where might one find this Mr. Brunner?" Frau Kessler gestured toward the window. "He works at the resort's maintenance shed near the base of the Hinterberg. But be careful, Fräulein. He's not fond of questions." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already planning her next move. A connection to an explosives expert, she thought, was the thread she needed, like a St. Mary Mead carpenter linked to a stolen tool that had solved a theft. Seizing the opportunity, Miss Marple enlisted Beatrice's help to arrange another visit to the Schwarzhorn, under the pretext of retrieving a lost item from their previous trip. Hans, though reluctant, agreed to accompany them, his face grim as he prepared the sleigh. Victor offered to join, his smile strained, while Clara declined, her fear of the slopes unshaken. Eric, when approached, refused curtly, claiming a headache, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, as if he sensed her closing in. At the Schwarzhorn, the slope was still closed, its surface a chaotic testament to the avalanche's force. Miss Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, directed Hans to the outcrop where she had found the explosive device. "I believe I dropped a scarf pin here," she said, her tone innocent, though her eyes were sharp. Hans, his face pale, helped her search, and within moments, Miss Marple uncovered the device again, its metal glinting in the snow. Hans's breath caught, his hands trembling as he examined it. This is a blasting cap," he said, his voice hoarse. "Used for controlled avalanches. It should not be here." His eyes met Miss Marple's, filled with a mix of shock and fear, and she knew he was not the culprit. His reaction was too raw, too unguarded. Returning to the chalet, Miss Marple kept the device hidden in her shawl, her mind racing. The blasting cap was proof of intent, but who had placed it? She recalled Frau Kessler's mention of Karl Brunner and resolved to seek him out. With Beatrice's help, she arranged a visit to the village under the guise of shopping for souvenirs. The maintenance shed was a squat building, its walls weathered by Alpine winters. Karl Brunner, a burly man with a scarred face, was polishing tools when Miss Marple approached, her knitting bag in hand, her smile disarming. "Mr. Brunner," she said, her voice gentle, "I'm told you're an expert in explosives. I'm curious about how they're used for avalanches, purely for my own education, of course." Brunner's eyes narrowed, but her elderly demeanor softened his suspicion. "It's technical work," he said gruffly. "We use small charges to trigger safe slides, prevent bigger ones. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's smile widened. "I heard you spoke with Mr. Larson recently. Did he show an interest in such things?" Brunner's face darkened, his hands pausing. "He asked about charges, said it was for a skiing article. I showed him a blasting cap, explained how it works. That was all. His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. Eric's interest in explosives was no coincidence. Back at the chalet, Miss Marple gathered the guests in the lounge, her resolve firm. Beatrice, sensing the moment, stood by her side, her face pale but determined. "We have evidence," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but commanding, holding up the blasting cap. "This was found on the Schwarzhorn, where Peter died. Someone placed it there deliberately." The room froze, all eyes on the device. Clara gasped, her hands covering her mouth. Victor's smile vanished, his face paling. Hans stared, his jaw tight. Eric leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "That's absurd," he snapped. "You're accusing me, aren't you? I had nothing to do with it." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Mr. Larson, you were seen near the ridge before the avalanche. You spoke with Karl Brunner about explosives, and Peter feared you, as his letter to Miss Henshaw shows." Eric's face reddened, his composure cracking. "I only wanted to scare him," he blurted, his voice breaking. "I set a small charge, just to shake him up, to make him falter in the race. I didn't mean for him to die." The room went silent, the confession hanging like a shard of ice. Clara sobbed, Hans's shoulders slumped, and Victor's eyes darted away, as if relieved the spotlight had shifted. Miss Marple nodded, her expression somber. "Intentions, Mr. Larson, do not undo consequences," she said softly. "Your ambition led to a tragedy." She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Youth, whose prank had ended in disaster, and knew that Eric's recklessness was no less deadly. The pieces, Clara's letter, Hans's testimony, Victor's tampering, the blasting cap, had formed a pattern, and Eric was its dark center. As the guests absorbed the revelation, Miss Marple's knitting resumed, her needles a steady rhythm against the silence. The truth was out, but justice would follow, and in the cold heart of Chalet Montagne, a killer had been unmasked. Chapter 12. Justice in the Alps. The 10th day at Chalet. Montagne broke with a serene stillness, the Alps gleaming under a sky of unblemished blue, as if the mountains themselves had exhaled after the storm of truth that had swept through the chalet the previous evening. Miss Jane Marple sat by the lounge's great window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, though her sharp eyes were softened by a quiet satisfaction. Eric Larson's confession, his reckless act of setting a small explosive charge to unsettle Peter Vanderveer, only to trigger a deadly avalanche, had unraveled the tangled web of suspicion that had ensnared the guests. The threads of motive, from Hans's guarded past to Victor's opportunism and Clara's hidden fears, had converged on Eric's ambition, and Miss Marple, with her insight honed in the quiet intrigues of St. Mary Mead, had brought the truth to light. Now, as the chalet prepared for the authorities' arrival, she reflected on the fragility of human nature, so easily swayed by envy and pride. Lady Beatrice Worthington entered the lounge, her face pale, but her demeanor resolute, a stark contrast to the vibrant hostess who had welcomed Miss Marple just days before. She wore a simple gray dress, her usual flair subdued, and settled beside her friend with a sigh. "Jane, I still can't believe it," she said, her voice low but steady. "Eric, of all people, so young, so driven, and yet so foolish, to think a moment's jealousy could lead to such a tragedy." She shook her head, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. "The police are coming this morning. Hans has been on the telephone with them, arranging everything." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze gentle but alert. "It is a sad business, Beatrice," she said softly. "But the truth, once uncovered, brings its own kind of peace. Mr. Larson will face justice, and poor Mr. Vandeveer's memory will be honored." Her tone was calm, but her mind lingered on the events of the previous day, when Eric's composure had crumbled under the weight of her quiet probing. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Youth, who had confessed to a theft after a similar unraveling, and knew that guilt, when cornered, often spoke for itself. The lounge was quiet, the guests subdued as they awaited the authorities. Clara Henshaw sat in her corner, her face less haunted now that her secret, the letter from Peter, had been shared. She clutched a cup of tea, her eyes occasionally meeting Miss Marple's with a flicker of gratitude. Hans Müller stood by the fire, his broad frame hunched, as if the weight of his role as guide still pressed on him. Victor Duval, his charm dimmed but not extinguished, busied himself with packing ski equipment, his movements brisk but his glances wary. Eric was absent, confined to his room under Hans's watchful eye until the police arrived, a precaution Beatrice had insisted upon. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and approached Clara, her smile warm and maternal. "Miss Henshaw," she said, settling beside the girl, "you were very brave to share Peter's letter. It must have been difficult." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a small nod. "I was so afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Peter trusted me, and I didn't know what to do. But you made it safe to speak." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead schoolgirl who had confided a secret after gentle encouragement. "Truth is a heavy burden, my dear," she said, "but sharing it lightens the load." As the morning progressed, the sound of sleigh bells announced the arrival of the Swiss police, their uniforms stark against the snow. Hans led them into the lounge, his face grim but composed, and introduced Inspector Keller, a tall man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. Beatrice, as hostess, took charge, explaining the events leading to Eric's confession, while Miss Marple stood quietly, her knitting a pretext for observation. Inspector Keller listened intently, his gaze sweeping over the guests, lingering on Clara's pale face and Victor's guarded expression. "Fräulein Marple," he said, turning to her, "Herr Müller tells me you found the explosive device and prompted the confession. We are grateful for your insight." His tone was respectful, and Miss Marple smiled modestly. "I only noticed what was there to see, Inspector," she said. "In my village, people are much the same. Ambition and fear leave traces, like footprints in snow." Keller nodded, his eyes crinkling with a hint of amusement, as if recognizing a kindred spirit in the unassuming elderly woman. The police took Eric into custody, his tall frame subdued as he was led to the sleigh, his blue eyes fixed on the floor. The guests watched in silence, their faces a mix of relief and sorrow. Clara turned away, her shoulders shaking, while Victor's expression was unreadable, as if weighing his own narrow escape from suspicion. Hans followed the police, his role as guide now entwined with delivering justice, though Miss Marple noted the weariness in his step, like a man who had carried too much for too long. Beatrice, standing by the window, turned to Miss Marple, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're a marvel, Jane," she said, her voice trembling. "Like a hawk spotting what we all missed. How did you know it was Eric?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile serene. "People, dear, are not so different, whether in St. Mary Mead or the Alps. Greed, envy, ambition. They leave patterns, clear as tracks in the snow. Eric's pride was his undoing, just as it was for a young man in my village who thought he could outwit his rival. She paused, her eyes distant. But the mountains, like truth, are unforgiving. As the day wore on, the guests began to disperse, their time at Chalet Montagne cut short by the tragedy. Victor announced his departure for a new teaching post in Zermatt, his charm returning as he bid farewell, though Miss Marple noted a flicker of relief in his eyes, as if escaping scrutiny. Clara, bolstered by her confession, spoke of returning to England, her voice steadier now. Hans remained, his duties to the chalet unbroken, though Miss Marple suspected he would carry Peter's death as a shadow on his conscience. That evening, as Miss Marple packed her modest valise, Beatrice joined her, offering a final cup of tea. "You've saved us, Jane," she said, her voice warm. "I'll never look at a quiet village the same way again." Miss Marple smiled, folding her knitting carefully. "Villages or chalets, dear, it's all the same. People's hearts are where the stories lie, and they tell them if you listen." She glanced out the window, where the Alps stood silent, their beauty undimmed by the darkness they had witnessed. The next morning, Miss Marple boarded the train for home, the Alps receding behind her like a memory. As the carriage rattled through the snowy valleys, she opened her knitting, her needles resuming their rhythm. The case of Peter Vanderveer was closed, justice served, but Miss Marple knew that human nature would always weave new mysteries. In the quiet of St. Mary Mead, she would be ready, her sharp eyes and gentle heart ever watchful for the truths hidden in the everyday.